Again, Hamas has learned, unfortunately, that terror produces results. Every success that they can point to from their perspective has been a result of terror. So that is essential.
Can Hamas be defeated? Hamas is an ideology. It's a terror movement. It's an offshoot, a Palestinian offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So as an ideology, can it be defeated? Can Israel bring about total victory, as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has described? Or is President Biden right that total victory isn't really possible and that we need to just reach some sort of permanent ceasefire? Or is there something in the middle? Welcome to the Inside the Epicenter podcast. I'm Joel Rosenberg, founder and chairman of the Joshua Fund, a ministry to bless Israel and her neighbors, including the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, in the name of Jesus. This is a ministry that my wife and I started in 2006, 18 years running, raising funds from evangelical Christians in North America and around the world to bless Israel and the Palestinians and other Arab people in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And we've been doing that and working mostly through the local churches, but blessing both Jews and Arabs, both people who are religious, who are non-religious, who are people. Obviously, we're here to strengthen the local church in the Middle East, which is not easy to do, but to bless those who are suffering, whether they're poor, needy, or victims of war and terrorism. So that's a big part of what the Joshua Fund has been doing. And of course, all Israel news, all Arab news, trying to help people understand what's going on. And Inside the Epicenter is our flagship podcast. And I'm very grateful as we deal with this topic of Hamas. Can it be defeated? How should Christians be thinking? How should the West be thinking? What's possible? To talk to someone who's become a friend and is a real expert on these matters. Ghaith Omari is a former advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the 1999 through 2001 permanent status peace talks that wound up at Camp David when then President Bill Clinton was trying to get then Prime Minister of Israel Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to make some sort of deal. It did not work, and some tragedy resulted. But Ghaith Omari was part of that negotiating team. He's the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Currently, he's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where his research focuses on Palestinian politics, Jordanian politics, and peace diplomacy. He's a regular commentator on these and other regional topics, and he also appears on American college campuses speaking on these issues, although that's getting tougher to do these days. Ghaith is also on the advisory board of All Arab News, and I really appreciate it. And that's really sort of his role at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. That's when I first met him, and it's in that capacity and in his role as on the advisory board for All Arab News that I asked him, would he come on this podcast? I can't tell you why I haven't had him on earlier, but we definitely need his expertise now. Ghaith, how are you? Good to talk to you. Good to see you.
Thanks, Joel. I mean, it's always a pleasure to see you, and it's really unfortunate that we reconnect under these circumstances. But thankfully, personally things are fine. But God help the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's one of the most tragic times that I've been through.
Yeah, it really is, and I'm not sure if even those who are regular listeners to this podcast fully grasp. If you don't live there or you're not from there, it's very difficult to understand that this is not like any war that either side has been through. It's longer, it's more painful, more people are dying and suffering. When you think of the whole history, and even just the modern history, the last 76 some years, let's say 77 since we even started the UN, resolutions of 1947 and sort of creating a two-state solution there and the whole partition plan. But if you think of just that period, it's hard to imagine that this could be the most painful and most complicated one. But you do believe that's the case.
Look, I mean, Joel, I was in Israel and the Palestinian areas back in February. And I have to say, I mean, both peoples are traumatized. In Israel, I heard over and over expressions of, Jewish vulnerabilities, all of the things that the state of Israel was created to overcome.
Yes.
All of these historic traumas are coming to the surface. I go to the Palestinian side and I talk to people, and the word that I heard more than anything is al-Nakba, the foundational trauma of modern Palestine. I lived through the second Intifada. It was nothing compared to this in terms of the sheer, numbers, death, destruction, but also the way it is affecting the deepest insecurities of both peoples. So yeah, unless you're there, really, it's really, really hard to grasp the enormity of this.
Yeah. Well, and I particularly appreciate your perspective for lots of reasons, some of which I've mentioned, but also because I'm having a hard time finding Palestinians who are willing to go on the record, at least with me. Now, I realize I'm an Israeli, I'm Jewish, and I'm an evangelical Christian. But I think I'm also one of the evangelicals, and certainly an Israeli evangelical, who is really leaning into encouraging the Christian world to have a compassion for the Palestinians. That doesn't mean you have to abandon your love for Israel. It's not a either or scenario. You can be pro-Palestinian and be pro-Israeli. You don't have to agree with every Israeli policy to support Israel and the Jewish people's right to have a state and to live in security. And nor do you have to agree with everything that Mahmoud Abbas is doing, and certainly not with Hamas is doing, to have a love and a compassion for the Palestinian people, especially those who are suffering in wartime. But I think it's so easy for these issues to, since I'm in the States right now, I'll say to become, I mean, this is trivializing it, but to become like, your one's favorite college basketball team. You're rooting for a team, and you're quite hostile to any evidence, even colors or flags or T-shirts, jerseys of the other team. And I think what we're talking about are people that are suffering in a war that is 9 months running, and there's no end in sight. And of course, it looks like it's going to expand to the north, which means it's engulfing a whole nother group of people day by day. So we want to do 2 podcasts with you. Originally, I was just asking you to come on to one, but I realized that there's so much I want to talk to you about that I think we wouldn't be doing this justice to cover everything in one topic. So in the next podcast that we'll do, that we'll record in a few moments, I want to look at the most recent polling of the Palestinian people, done by the most respected pollster that there is, somebody who, not everybody believes in polls, especially during times of war, but I think this is somebody that everybody in the region believes is very, very credible. So we'll get to that. What do the Palestinians think about October 7th? What do they believe these days about a 2-state solution? Do they have hope for the future? And what is that? What do they want? And how does that differ between the Palestinians who do live in Gaza and Palestinians who live in the West Bank? Because I'm noticing significant differences between those two. And I think that's really important. So I want to get into that in the next podcast. But today, what I want to do is focus on this question that you have raised in a policy piece that you did for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy called, "Can Hamas Be Defeated?" Now, again, just to set it up for our listeners and our viewers around the world, mostly in North America, however, Prime Minister Netanyahu is calling for total victory. Now, you could say that's just a political slogan, but he believes that he has a definition of it. We can talk a little bit about what he thinks total victory looks like. But President Joe Biden is saying that's not possible. His advisors seem to believe it's not possible to get total victory over Hamas. And even the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces spokesman, recently said, no, you really can't have total victory over Hamas because it's an ideology. You can take away the guns, you can take away their military capacity, but you can't defeat an ideology. And so you raised this as a question, and I thought your analysis was so interesting that rather than just write an article about it, I thought, all right, let me bring you on to the Inside the Epicenter podcast and just let you start to walk your way through several different nuances in it. But why don't you begin with your basic argument, and then I'll pull on some threads, if that's okay.
Thanks, Joel. I wrote this article because I was frustrated from what I was hearing on both ends of the spectrum. On one end, there are people who are saying, oh, you cannot defeat ideas with guns and bombs. And on the other end, there are those who are saying, oh, nothing can move until Hamas's ideology completely disappears. And I would argue that both ends are actually incorrect. Let me start with the first one. An organization like Hamas does not only depend on its the strength of its arguments and ideas to perpetuate itself. It depends on the use of terror and violence. And without denying them these tools, then Hamas will always be able to shape the political reality. Hamas, has learned, unfortunately, through experience, that using terror, they managed to derail the peace process in the 1990s. Using terror, they managed to upend Palestinian politics and take over Gaza violently in 2007. I believe, or 6, I can't remember the year. They learned through October 7th that they can actually derail regional diplomacy by basically, after October 7th, the Saudi-Israeli normalization talks went off track, at least for the time being. So you have to deny them their military tools, and at the same time, and you can only do that using military force. On the other side, I think there is plenty of evidence to show that ideologies don't disappear. Even the ideologies which have been most discredited, most immoral, still exist. There are still Nazis out there. There are still communists out there. You're never going to deny it. But to defeat something like Hamas, you have to have a combination of both military force that is necessary, and it has to be sustained. Not only what we're seeing in the war in Gaza, and I have my criticism in the way that the war is being conducted, but ultimately something like Hamas has to be confronted by military force, but also it has to be sustained even after the war to ensure that they cannot reconstitute. But that is not enough. You need to create an alternative, and that is essential in order to defeat them. At the end of the day, Hamas is popular because the alternative is, a corrupt, ineffective Palestinian Authority is so ineffective. And I would conclude with one point. I often hear that, war always produces radicalization. Now, of course, war is tragic. If you look at what's coming from Gaza now, the images are really heartbreaking. If you look at what happened on October 7th, that was a travesty beyond, human comprehension. Yet if you look at war in general, we're often informed in this country by our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which ended up, frankly, with a disaster. Yet we sometimes forget that other wars have actually produced better futures. I look at, for example, Vietnam today. You go to Vietnam after, what was, by all accounts, a brutal war, and look at a country that is hopeful, that is looking forward. Go to Rwanda. Again, if there's one genocide in this last century besides the Holocaust, it was Rwanda and Bosnia. Look at Rwanda today. It's a successful, vibrant society. So much of what the future holds depends on what you create after the war. But sometimes a war is necessary to remove a foe that is whose whole mode of operation, whose whole effectiveness is based on its use of terror and military means.
Well, that's true, and I think that one of the points you make in the article, and of course we'll include a link to your article and several others in our show notes. So I encourage our readers and viewers, listeners, to check out those show notes. But you make the point, going back to World War II, that Nazi Germany. Okay, yeah, there are Nazis. You just alluded to that yourself. But to say that we shouldn't have defeated Nazi Germany militarily because you can't stamp out all of Nazism forever and ever and get rid of every copy of Mein Kampf or what have you was ridiculous. Of course, we had to defeat a military foe and bring down a government. They didn't guarantee us that Germany was going to become a successful, peaceful democracy, pro-Western, even at least from my perspective, pro-Israel, and certainly compassionate towards the Palestinians. But that is what happened. It's what we hoped would happen. But we had to start with a military defeat, and it was a crushing military defeat. In fact, I would say that the defeat of Germany in World War I clearly was not a crushing defeat. It was a military victory, but we won the war, but we didn't win the peace. And so a virus remained. In fact, it may have been accelerated in how the West handled Germany afterwards. Maybe it was inevitable. I mean, that's a whole other podcast. But the point is, whatever was evil and globalist in its ambition in Germany was not stopped by World War I, but it was stopped by World War II. And you can look at, I think, what happened in Japan. You had an imperial Japanese system that was so hostile to us, so hostile to every country in the region, and yet it was militarily defeated, and it is a successful democracy and an economic power and an ally and not a threat, right? So those are examples. But now you also talk in your article about ISIS, which you're right, we did defeat the Islamic State. The caliphate was brought down. That doesn't mean Syria has become a successful country. Obviously it has not, or Iraq, or other parts of the ISIS-infected areas. So how does one prioritize and navigate through dealing both with military forces and threats and the ideologies?
Again, you need both. I mean, as you rightly said, a crushing military defeat is necessary. And as I look at what happened on October 7th, no country on earth can be expected to undergo what Israel underwent that day and not respond. Remember, in our own country, when we had 9/11, we went straight to Afghanistan because this is where those who were those who were harboring Al Qaeda. So that is necessary. That is necessary as a matter of principle. Otherwise, what's the point of the world order where a country is attacked and cannot defend itself? But also, it is necessary in order to deny, as I mentioned earlier, Hamas the tools to be a spoiler. Again, Hamas has learned, unfortunately, that terror produces results. Every success that they can point to from their perspective has been a result of terror. So that is essential. However, again, what differentiates, and that takes me to the ideology side now, what differentiates Japan and Germany and Vietnam and Rwanda, and I'm sure there are other examples out there, from, say, ISIS in Syria or Iraq after Saddam, etc., is that in the latter example, basically what came after was just something that no human being can actually respect. A corrupt government in Iraq, a brutal dictatorship that we see today in Syria with Bashar Assad. So in the former set of examples, what came was something hopeful. What came, whether it is the Marshall Plan in Europe and the reconstruction, after World War II, we did not go to the Germans and say, hey, you lost the war, pay up. We went to the Germans and said, you lost the war, and now we're going to help you get back on your feet in terms that are good for you, but also good for the rest of the world. So at that time, if you were a German, you would look and say, you know what? The future holds some hope. If you are an Iraqi, say, after the war, if you're a Syrian after the defeat of ISIS, and look at what came after that, would you have hope? Of course you wouldn't. So in that case, I think what comes after is as important as what happens before. And to tell you the truth, this is one of my biggest frustrations today with Netanyahu and with the Israeli government. The unwillingness to come up with a day after, the unwillingness to marshal countries which are interested in playing a role in the day after given certain conditions. And again,
all right, hold that thought, Ghaith. I think that's a very important point, and I think it's very important for evangelicals who are listening and watching to understand that. And I want to unpack that moment. We need to go to a break. When we come back, Ghaith Omari, who is a Palestinian specialist on Palestinian politics, Jordanian politics, regional politics. He himself has worked very closely with top Palestinian leaders in trying to negotiate peace in the past, and his perspective is very important. And we'll be back on the Inside the Epicenter podcast with Ghaith Omari in just a moment. Our passage of the day, our Bible verse of the day, comes from Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, where the Lord speaks through his servant who's writing, saying, "Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy." I think that's a great passage to think about in the context of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And some of our prayer requests that we'd encourage you to be praying for this week would be praying for Palestinians in Gaza who are suffering. There's 2.2 million who are there. And Almost all of them, of course, are now displaced because of the war, sometimes displaced several times. There are humanitarian relief issues. There are now crime issues, as there's not a police force to protect people. Hamas terrorists as a military is being defeated, but it's not complete. And there are therefore vacuums being left in terms of security, obviously in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of sanitation and all the other things. The entire government of Gaza, which was run by Hamas, has effectively broken down. And so we need to be praying with compassion for the people of Gaza. And we also need to be praying for healing emotionally, spiritually, physically, and of course, financial challenges that are more devastating for both Palestinians in Gaza and for Israelis on those border communities than I think most of us can really fathom. This is very, very serious. And how do we go forward? How can the people on either side have hope? And I would say that Gaza needs to be liberated, not from Israel, who left Gaza in 2005, but from the reign of terror of Hamas. But then what? What happens the day after? And how can Christians play a useful and effective and compassionate role? So these are some of the things I'd like to ask all of our viewers and listeners of the Inside the Epicenter podcast to be thinking about and to be praying about. Welcome back to the Inside the Epicenter podcast. I'm Joel Rosenberg, the founder and chairman of the Joshua Fund. My wife and I started the Joshua Fund in 2006. So 18 years we've been trying to find our way to mobilize, educate evangelical Christians in the United States, Canada, and around the world to understand biblically God's heart and love for both Israelis and Palestinians and others in the region. And how are we supposed to understand what's happening there now, as well as what's happened in the past, what the Bible says will happen in the future, and how do we have compassion and act in practical ways to show love and care to people who are really struggling in a very, very difficult neighborhood. And so joining us to discuss some of these issues, not so much how to tie the threads together in terms of how Christians should respond, but to understand what is the situation in Gaza. Ghaith al-Omari, again, a Palestinian himself, part of the Palestinian peace process with the Israelis back 25 years ago. That did not work out, although it was one of the most generous offers that President Bill Clinton sort of, I don't know if he persuaded or nudged then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak to offer to then Palestinian Chairman Yasser Arafat. It did not work out. That's another podcast I would love to do with you in the future, Ghaith, because I think going back to that time, especially since you were part of that process and you had eyes in, and of course you studied it closely in the quarter of a century since, it's such a missed opportunity, one that even former President Bill Clinton in his own memoirs writes about his anger at Yasser Arafat, who called him, I believe, as Clinton was leaving office, and Arafat praised him as a great president, and Clinton was angry at him and said, you made my, I don't remember the exact language, but basically he was upset that Arafat had not accepted this very generous offer. Again, we can get into that at a different time, but my point is, it's not like Israel hasn't been trying to make offers. And again, Palestinians can, have varying perspectives on whether those offers were generous enough. But you're a unique person. What I'm trying to do here is not answer that point, but was simply describe that you've had eyes in and even a voice into these matters for a long time. And that's why I asked you to be part of this conversation and the next podcast that will come up. And of course, you also serve on the, in addition to serving at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, you're on the advisory board for All Arab News. And that's important to me because I don't ask people to come on the advisory board because they agree with me, but because they will bring a different perspective, a unique and important perspective to our reporting and to our commentary. So thank you again, Ghaith, for being on the Inside the Epicenter podcast to discuss these issues.
Thank you, Joel, for your friendship before everything else.
Well, I'm grateful. If friendships can survive these challenging times, that's a good thing, and I value yours. So I asked you to hold, but not because I was trying to cut you off, just for time. So let's get back in. You were making a criticism of my previous boss, but it's not like we're super close or anything, so you can say whatever you need to say. But of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, your criticism that he is not, and you're not the only one. He's got multiple Israeli leaders as well as world leaders who are saying, hey, you need a day after plan and you need to lay it out so we can get a sense of where you're going with this thing. Why don't you pick up with that criticism so people can hear it and understand whether they agree with you or not? It's important that they hear your perspective.
And first of all, I mean, in the same way that I'm going to criticize your former boss, I'm going to criticize my former boss, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Okay. So we can be equal opportunity criticizers.
All right. You're not going to hear that every day on the Inside the Epicenter podcast, but it's important why we do what we do is so people are honest and fair with their perspective.
But look, I mean, what Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing right now is that he is refusing to adopt any plan for Gaza the day after the war. Now, this is not something that, someone like myself is advising him to do. This is something where his own military folks are advising him. What the military in Israel is saying is that, yes, as a military, we can do the military part of the campaign. And they're doing it right now. I have my own criticisms, but they are doing what they are trained to do, what they are equipped to do. But what they're telling Netanyahu is that in order to really defeat Hamas, military is necessary but insufficient. You need to have clarity on the day after. You need to create an alternative to Hamas in Gaza. And I would add, there is a unique opportunity here because not only are the Palestinians interested in something different, but there are many actors in the region who want to play a constructive role in Gaza after Hamas to ensure that Hamas is defeated. Yet Netanyahu, for his own reasons, and I assume these are political, is holding off on coming up or putting out a plan for a day after. Not for the lack of such plans. I engage with different Israeli official departments, and I know there are many plans in the development. It's a political decision. But without having clarity on the day after, we will end up with a vacuum. And as we saw again in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and the list goes on and on. Unless we have an alternative, despair sets in, and an organization like Hamas really feeds on despair. And so this is my criticism. But as I said, if there is a credible plan for a day after, I believe that the region and the good actors in the region will play a role. I would have one footnote here to add, which is part of this plan. I mean, we're focusing on Gaza, and rightly so. Because this is where things are happening. Yet, as we talk about a future, we have to talk about the future of the Palestinian people in general. And as much as Hamas is not only a part of a problem, Hamas is the problem. Hamas is, in my mind at least, a morally corrupt terrorist organization. Yet also, unless we reform the Palestinian Authority, unless we create a Palestinian governance that is free of corruption, free of all of the shenanigans that we see the Palestinian Authority engaged in, then it's very hard to counter Hamas, and it's very hard for the Palestinians to have hope. So it has to be a multifaceted approach.
Well, I agree with that. I'm sympathetic to the criticisms of Prime Minister Netanyahu for not laying out a plan, but I also find myself a bit conflicted, and I'll tell you why. First of all, there is a tremendous impatience with the Israeli government about winning this war, even prosecuting this war. When you think of the Americans taking 20 years to then lose in Afghanistan, ignominiously under President Biden just a couple years ago, this was very painful, right? And that was a 20-year process. And we're 9 months in, we still have hostages. I'm not entirely sure it's realistic that an Israeli prime minister with any type of political coalition can truly be expected to know the right way forward while you're prosecuting the war. Now, again, it's not that I don't think that these are the right sets of questions to be asked. I'm struggling with the impatience that looks like more than impatience, not from you, but I'm struggling from the United States. Let's not even deal with the UN or the EU or NATO or anybody else. If you're talking about President Biden, so where's the patience? What is the sense of extreme urgency that the Israeli government can't be, the idea that weapons aren't being moved on a regular basis? Because everything that's done to make Israel look like we're in trouble, we're not doing it right, it's actually emboldening the enemy. So if the goal is at least to get to a military victory, whatever the definition of that is, as rapidly as possible, then it seems like some of the steps the Biden administration has taken, and again, I'm not trying to make a partisan point. If Trump were doing this, I would say the same thing about Trump. I have plenty of criticisms of Trump on various issues, but that impatience strikes me as problematic, because the other thing is what Netanyahu is trying to avoid saying, let's just be honest, is we need to control the security space and we don't trust anybody else to do it. It's not that anyone else couldn't do it, but if for whatever reason they don't do it, and now Egypt's in charge of the security in Gaza, or the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is in charge, or a coalition of Jordanians and Egyptians and Emiratis and Bahrainis and Saudis are all in there, and a terrorist action happens or a set of rockets comes firing and Israel feels like it has to move again, who are we moving against? Now we're moving against actual allies. And we don't want to get into a shooting war. And of course, it hasn't worked with the UN making a secure situation in southern Lebanon. So Israel is actually not, Netanyahu doesn't want to say, hey, we're going to run the security forces for all of Gaza for the next 15 years until we can gain some confidence. That's the main thing he's trying to avoid.
Actually, I mean, as I hear Netanyahu, that's the one thing that he's been clear about, which is, he, I think, is on the record saying Israel will have security control or overriding security control in Gaza for the indefinite future. And by the way, I understand this, and, I might not be thrilled about it, but at the end of the day, I don't, what happened on October 7th, I can see why the Israelis are saying we don't trust anyone when it comes to security. But I think the criticism and the impatience comes from a number of places. I think part of it is there's a sense, and I feel this when I talk to some of our folks in the military who served in Iraq in particular, maybe less so Afghanistan, is that Israel is making many of the same mistakes that we made in Iraq. And part of the mistake that we made in Iraq was having no real view of what comes after Saddam. And I think we ended up with running that country at a time where actually had we had something laid up from the beginning, we might have had something different. So that's kind of one part of it. But another part of it is the argument, which I actually believe in, is that conducting the military operation and the military side of the war is always easier if you have diplomatic support from around, at least from the main players in the world. And now, some of the folks that you and I know in the Gulf in particular, but also in Egypt and in Jordan, would say in private conversations, and some of them have said it even publicly, that, look, if you want us to basically be partners in the day after, if you want us to be more vocal about Hamas, by the way, many of those Arab countries believe Hamas is a terrorist organization, and they see it as both an extension of Iran and an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the arch enemies of moderate Arab states. But what they're saying is, if you want us to have that space, if Israel wants us to have that space, then Israel will also have to give us a political context to come and involved in. And that part of the political context is, let's have a plan for the day after. No one's saying that you start implementing the day after today. But what I would like to see Netanyahu do is come and say, once Hamas is defeated, then, the following will come. Then I will invite the Palestinian Authority, after it's been reformed, to come and invite the Emiratis to help with the education and moved away from radicalization to a more open educational system. I want to invite the Saudis to come and deal with, public sector reform to create an efficient, non-corrupt bureaucracy. You start putting this in place right now and condition it all on basically Hamas' defeat. If you do that, it becomes easier, frankly, for a country like Egypt to come and say to Hamas, and even Saudi and others, say to Hamas, look, you are the obstacle. Today, with the lack of a vision, it looks like it's a stalemate. And frankly, these countries, when Hamas says, look, the Israelis want to come and permanently occupy Gaza, they don't really have much of a counter argument. So I think this is where my frustration is.
Fair enough. I agree with that. That assessment. And what I'm looking for next is the July 24th speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu here in this city, in Washington, D.C., before a joint session of Congress. I've been invited by a member of Congress to attend, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I happen to have had the opportunity, I would say the honor of attending Netanyahu's speech to the joint session when he dealt with the Iran nuclear issue under that very controversial moment under the Obama-Biden tenure, that was a momentous speech. Lots of criticism and lots of praise from different directions. But Netanyahu has an opportunity. And it strikes me that if he does not use this opportunity in this upcoming speech, it will be a huge missed opportunity, possibly as big a missed opportunity to lay out an actual vision of what it could be in Gaza, maybe as big as the miss by Yasser Arafat back in 2000, 2001. And I would just close this thought because we'll pick this up in our next conversation. Our next podcast will be about the polling of what do the Palestinian people say they want and how does that differ between Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, because there are important nuances. We're going to get to that in the next program. But just to wrap up this thought, Netanyahu has a big stage coming up on the 24th of July. I think the relationships that he's been building with Sunni Arab leaders, he now knows as well as anybody in the region, any Israeli leader in the past, for sure, that the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis have learned how to change an education system from being entirely run and riddled by Muslim Brotherhood thinking, purposefully, intentionally, to non-Muslim Brotherhood thinking, and to change the media and change, policing. And there's a lot of reforms. Again, not those countries have made everything right, but the progress that have been made, and I've gotten to see it up close and personal, that's been so impressive that this is exactly the moment that Israel wants to tap that expertise. But Netanyahu's got to find a way to have the courage of his convictions and lay out what his vision, and to not be intimidated by, he has some real lunatics on the far right of his coalition. So let me give you the last word and then we'll close up this podcast. Any last thoughts about that?
Yes, actually, I want to go and dig deeper into what you just said. It is not only, I would say, expertise that these countries are having. I mean, look, you and I have been following this region for a long time, and something momentous is happening right now. In the past, if you look at Arab politics, it was always based on grievances, on a sense of entitlement, on large cross-boundary ideologies, be it Pan-Arabism, be it Islamism, etc. If you look at what's happening today in the Gulf, in Saudi, in the UAE. I mean, the UAE has been the trailblazer. Saudi is doing amazing work. As you said, Bahrain, others, not Qatar. Morocco outside the Gulf. These are countries which are basically building an identity and a sense of self that is all about the future. I just spent a week in Saudi a month ago. Every conversation from my Uber driver to cabinet ministers is about, a hopeful, forward-looking vision. This is the type of energy that I have not seen in my career in the Arab world. I'm seeing hope, I'm seeing a sense of agency, a sense of possibility. This is personally the kind of energy I want to import into Gaza the day after. This is the kind of energy I want to see involved in rebuilding the Palestinian Authority. But this requires the Israelis to reciprocate. And I think, as you said, Bibi has an opportunity. I think it will be fully understandable if he stands before Congress and expresses the pain and the grievances. I mean, the Israelis certainly are entitled to their pain and grievances after what happened. Yet it will be a missed opportunity if he does not come up with something positive. I think if he comes up with something positive, this will make the region more willing to engage. This will make the region not only more willing to engage with Israel, but also more willing to engage with Gaza on the day after. So for all of this kind of, doom and gloom and real tragedy that we're seeing right now, I still see an opportunity, if in the day after, we can create a condition where this change that we're seeing elsewhere in the Arab world can be brought to the Palestinians. I think that can be a game changer.
Ghaith al-Omari, a Palestinian expert, Palestinian himself, a part of the Palestinian peace process, and an expert at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, for Near East Policy, as well as on the advisory board of All Arab News. This is such a great conversation. I'm so grateful, and it sets up for our next conversation very well. Thank you, Ghaith. I really appreciate you being with us. And thank all of you for listening, for watching the Inside the Epicenter podcast, both on regular podcasting platforms as well as on YouTube. And really appreciate you listening to this conversation with a Palestinian who has a really unique insight into the the past, the present, and the future of the Palestinian people. If you'd like to learn more about the Joshua Fund and what we do, who we are, please visit our website at www.joshuafund.com. Again, www.joshuafund.com, and find out how we're trying to be involved in both educating Christians and mobilizing Christians to pray for and financially invest in making a difference in Israel and among the Palestinians and other Arabs in the region. So again, you can check that out at joshuafund.com. And of course, you can check out all of our things that we've mentioned here, including articles by Ghaith and others, in our show notes. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this episode of Inside the Epicenter. I'm Joel Rosenberg in Washington. God bless you.
I'm Joel Rosenberg. On your left, you'll find some videos we've chosen specifically for you. We look forward to partnering with you to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus.